LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Peter Strother, who joins us to discuss his book, Spiritual Beings or Economic Tools, Just Who Are We? In much of the modern world, we are trapped in a loop of work, consume, sleep, repeat. Those conscious of this soul-destroying cycle are often even more dejected and disillusioned than those who blindly bow to the demands of consumerist culture, pursuing desires which are not their own, slaves to the opinions of others, and more afraid of the unknown than of hollow, haunted subsistence. Empty and unfulfilled, billions trudge wearily towards a death subconsciously feared, but still denied throughout a life deemed to be devoid of either meaning or purpose. But in the early 21st century, converging economic, political, social and environmental crises are making the grinding routine of business as usual increasingly impossible. Frustration and broken promises are boiling over in increasing unrest, violence and destruction of both the system and the self. The first steps towards breaking free of the tyranny of comfort and complacency are self-awareness, self-knowledge and self-mastery, all of which are actively discouraged in the matrix of mindless media, digital distractions, junk food, and instant gratification. Through choice, or by force, and sooner rather than later, we will all have some difficult decisions to make as the world we persist in taking for granted simply disappears. Hello and welcome, Peter, and thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
It's good to be here, and it'll be good to have a chat with you.
Peter, today we're going to be talking a little bit about your book, some ideas spinning off of that. The book's entitled Spiritual Beings or Economic Tools, Just Who Are We? Now, that's been out for some time. Before we dive into all this, perhaps you just let listeners know a little bit about your background and your work in general.
Yes, well, I started out in newspaper journalism in the north of England, and then I moved down to Oxford, and then the next step was on into London, although beyond that I didn't go that far. I decided to come north and explore something else. I went into journalism. I think there was a combination of, I enjoyed writing. Writing has always been my form of expression. And at the same time, I was a search for truth. There was always something in me from an early age that said there was something deeper to life, this search for truth. I felt that I was hanging on to it under the pressures of once you go to school, and then beyond school, careers officers telling you, seem to be dictating a certain way of life, career, and all the rest. And the deeper questions within me were always there, but they weren't being answered, I felt, by anything that was happening to me within society. My school didn't really answer any of the questions there. Even the kind of church within the school that I went to, it was more of an authoritarian sense of morality about it that weren't actually answering the deeper questions about what I would call a spiritual life within myself. It wasn't being answered in my home life, and even when I went into journalism, it wasn't being particularly answered. That deeper sense of search for truth about the meaning and purpose of our lives. But it was journalism that I started out in, and I don't regret that time at all. It was a good career to start out in, and gave me opportunities to learn about the way society is constructed, and the governments, the local governments, the way things are run, politics, economics. So it was a good grounding.
Part of what you just outlined there is very much a theme that runs throughout the book. It might even be the overarching theme. To address that, we'll start by talking about where we are right now. That's you and I as individuals, people listening to this, society at large, or maybe perhaps society right across Western industrialized nations, and in other parts of the world in different ways and to a greater or lesser extent. Many people feel trapped and frustrated in the lives that they have. Now, they may consider themselves to be essentially happy, quite fulfilled on some level, but for many increasing numbers of people, as I say, they feel trapped within a system of a repetitive pattern of work, consume, sleep, repeat. Now, this can also speak to, some of the eternal existential questions about the meaning of life. That is true. But the society that we've made for ourselves, I say, particularly in the West over the last few centuries, has locked us into this pattern increasingly. And yet that seeking something else, something higher, something better, whatever it happens to be, that feeling has never gone away. And it's kind of creeping back in now. And I think that's symptomatic of a time of crisis. And for many people now, they feel that the end of a tether, that they can no longer suppress those urges to seek something better. And things are bubbling to the surface that are making increasing numbers of people feel very uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think this when I was, as I talked about when I was younger, this even from a young age, this deeper sense, there was something deeper within me. I couldn't identify it, but I felt almost like I was in an alien world to a degree. I'm reminded of a quote by Pierre Taylor de Chardin. He's a French Jesuit priest. He says, "We are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience." Now that resonated within me because it told me that, it tells me now, and I felt it to a degree then as a young kid, that we've got it back to front. And I increasingly feel that now. And I think that is one of the reasons why people feel a great sense of schism within themselves, because under the pressures of what you're just speaking about, of work and increasing pressures, they are not perhaps able to, haven't got the time to explore these deeper issues. And if we don't explore them, if we don't have the time, as I'm fortunate enough living in the Highlands of Scotland, to go walk in the hills, or we haven't got the time for say meditation or mindfulness, or just any time at all, then these things can fester away within us. These questions that are not answered. And for some reason, we don't understand why, but there's a sense of dissatisfaction within us. Of course, within society, we can have superficial things that can keep us going. We do well at work, for instance, we get promotion or something, or a wage rise, or we enjoy holidays, all the usual trappings of a capitalist society. But none of these, perhaps, are enduring. And I think we're looking for something enduring, particularly if we come across a crisis in our lives. Someone close to us becomes ill, or we lose our job, or something fragments our ideal life that we have within the capitalist society. And then we are almost propelled to ask these deeper questions about ourselves. But up until that point, I think it is a kind of a festering away within ourselves of not being able to answer these deeper questions. Because I think inherently, as that quote that I read out suggests, we are, whatever conscious level we're aware of it, I do believe we are spiritual, have a sense of spirituality within us.
Speaking about the format of your book, that's actually quite interesting because you've got regular chapters, and at the end of each one you've got what you call a little meditation, just a reflection on some dimension of what you've been speaking of. But interspersed throughout the book, you have what appear to be fictionalized accounts, and you can throw some light on this in a second, fictionalized accounts of real people's lives. All of these characters are undergoing some kind of crisis or breakdown, and I'm just wondering how you came to decide on that format, and are in fact these stories of real people that you've known or heard from? Because some of them are actually really uncomfortable to read, some really difficult things that people are going through. And one of them is actually called Peter's Story, and I wondered if it was anything to do with you.
Well, to answer your last question first, no, that particular story doesn't relate to me. It's just the names were, they are, some of them are people I have known or reflect aspects of their lives. The reason I chose to put these stories in is obviously there's an analysis in each chapter of a journey we take from confronting our enslavement within the system, is what the first part is called, and then eventually we go through a sense of onto discovering who we actually are through a journey that we go on in the lives that we lead. The reason I chose the fictional accounts was I didn't want it to become too analytical, and I do feel, there's a great history of parables, and I wanted to use parables as a way of hopefully people could identify with the characters and the crisis that many people go through different kinds of crisis in their lives. It's a long journey we all go on, and they're multivarious, and then they're not altogether obvious ones. We're not always certain that we're going through something. For instance, the initial story that you referred to, Peter's Story, is just a guy who is he's newly married. He's just had the first child, but work is bearing down on him, pressures of work. And there's this kind of miracle of birth of this child that comes into his and his wife's life. And he sees it as much more just the birth of a child. It's something miraculous about it that he can't quite identify with, that it's beyond what we would normally understand. But this pressure, again, there's no time to explore this. And again, I want to talk about festering away. He feels the pressure of work. He's had his short paternity leave. He goes back, and the things are piled high on his desk. And again, these deeper questions he can't answer. And then pressures come in on to do with his work. He's moved. He has to take on other responsibilities. Has to take work home at night. You get the picture, and I think that happens to a lot of people. Increasingly in the capitalist society, there is a greater demand that people produce more in less time, and not necessarily for good wages, and that has a massive impact not just on your work life, but on your home life too. It has an effect on your loved ones, and I wanted to explore that pressure within people. I'm happy to say most of the stories, come to some kind of resolvement. People, the light that they feel within themselves. Situations happen, not necessarily of their own volition or desire, but things do happen that bring about a change, which it brings about a sense of awareness, which they are transforms their lives. As you say, it's not always comfortable, but then life isn't always comfortable. It's often very uncomfortable for people, and I think that perhaps reflects the journey we go on. For most people, there are very difficult times, but at the same time, there is enlightenment, there is hope, and an enduring sense of hope. And hopefully, in the world we live in now, that is still coming to the fore. The present environmental situation, just as one example off the top of my head, that there is hope in the sense of the young people's reaction through Extinction Rebellion, and that is taking place at the moment, and For future generations, speaking to young people, I do feel that there is a great sense of hope within them, despite the difficulties of the world that they have been born into and are confronting at the moment.
You mentioned earlier the feeling that many people have, and perhaps they can be a third, halfway, 3/4 of the way through their life before it really dawns on them that they've been steered into a path that was not of their own choosing. And you also made a passing reference to careers teachers at school. And I like to tell a little anecdote of my own one particular meeting with careers teacher when I was a teenager. And he was actually the biology teacher. I don't know why he was giving careers counselling, because he didn't seem to like being a biology teacher. So I'm wondering what qualifies him to give careers advice. But I remember saying, a little bit vaguely articulated, saying, not sure specifically, but I really would like to do something in music. And the first thing, he just came straight back at me and said, oh, perhaps you should be a bit more realistic. And that kind of summed it up for me. But our desires quite often are not our own. The path that we're on, and then subsequently what we think we want. And whether it's family pressure, some people, I've known people who've gone into high profile, high powered careers that they didn't really want because of the family kind of expected it, or it would please the family, whether it's peer pressure or whether it's a kind of corporate state that steers us collectively in certain directions. Some people kind of feel they want something different, but one of the problems in getting past all of what I've just described, all of that pathology, is actually knowing what you want. And many people have never really honestly asked themselves that question, and it's not really encouraged. What do you really want?
Yes, no, I agree with that entirely, and that can lead to a great crisis later in your life if that life kind of falls apart, particularly at work. You lose your job, particularly, and many people lose their jobs at some point in their lives. There is a very good quote, this one actually in the book, by the theologian Albert Schweitzer. What he said was, because society with its developed organization exercises a hitherto unknown power over man, man's dependency on it has grown to a degree that he has almost ceased to live a mental existence of his own. That comes in my chapter of the collective, about the collective mindset, which I think runs through so much of society. It's almost become a mantra about the way we're supposed to exist. And that carries us along. And while things are going well, that seems to be okay. But there are so many things that happen to us along the journey, whether it's a career or families that we would then have a family or whatever. But so many things can go wrong along that journey. There's a security in it in some ways if things are fine, but it at the same time it doesn't truly, particularly when things go wrong, it doesn't define who we truly are. And if we don't answer that question, then there is always something missing. And so to me, there's a certain deceit about it, about this existence, because it doesn't, and whether this is to do with a failure society, certainly you can point to the churches and religion, because in many ways they are part of the institution themselves, when I would argue they should be separate from it. What on earth, for example, are bishops and archbishops sitting in the House of Lords for, part of that institution? They should be there to offer people spiritual guidance rather than being part of the institution, the establishment itself. So I totally understand, where you're coming from with the question, and I think it is very hard for people. As you say, later in life, or at any stage in life, if there's a crisis, people can suddenly be confronted with, in a quite a shocking way, with, what am I, how many people have asked that question? Is this really all there is to it? At some stage in our lives. I mean, I carry that question with me throughout my time in journalism and beyond, but, for some people, it suddenly can come at them, through a crisis. The other thing society does, there are rewards in society, but they can lead us into secondary, what I would call addictions. The kind of things I'm talking about, where there are these rewards, alcohol and other things that can lead into gambling. These even retail therapies are a particularly prominent one at the moment, and people feel that the rewards are worth it. But again, this is all disguising the deeper truth, the deeper journey that we need to go on.
But even people who have been materially, who've wanted for nothing in their lives have reached either a crisis coming at them externally or simply facing their own mortality, facing their own death, and been haunted by exactly the same questions. And then suddenly and again, I don't think that material things are necessarily the enemy. It's just our view of them and how important we deem them to be. But as I say, people who've wanted for nothing are left facing the same questions, when all is said and done.
Yes, no, absolutely. Strangely, for a book like this, I quote the Queen at the beginning of the second half, because I can remember she had a horrific time at one point, and we all know, there were various divorces in the family, children, and we know how that can all affect us all. And I do mention in the book that, and very few people are more wealthy or protected from what is going on in society than perhaps she is. But at the same time, these deeply personal things, when none of us are protected at that point from what she went through at that particular time. I understand she is a very spiritual person herself, but still at that point, none of us are protected from these things. It can make things slightly easier, but not particularly when things are happening to those we love. I'm not particularly talking about her now, but then at that point, any of us can face crisis, and we have to go on a deeper journey at that point, perhaps in the second part of our life, perhaps before then. But I do believe it is a necessary journey, and because we're going to have to confront it at some point. I'm reminded of a story when I have had been involved with both churches, the Anglican Church I was confirmed in, and the Church of Scotland since I've been up here. I've been very much on the margins of the church, but there are a lot of good people in the church too, but the story relates to an early day when I was confirmed in the Anglican Church, and I was 27 years of age, and I went to be confirmed. And what I noticed was the people in the church were either 14, a lot of 14-year-olds around that kind of age, or the rest of them were in their kind of mid-80s. And I was this very in the middle, slightly younger, but largely in the middle. And the Bishop of Chester, who confirmed us that night, said, "What on earth are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, the 14-year-olds you can see there have all been forced to come by their parents. And the 80-year-olds are all there because they're facing the end of their lives. So what on earth are you doing here at 27? And I understood what he meant. I was there because I was confronting that crisis in my life where that deeper meaning of family comes to the fore, and I was having to answer the question. But, that is what people are confronted with, it tends to be towards the end of our life, but it can happen at any point. And it is a necessary journey that we have to go on.
And yet, when it comes to trying to make, because for a lot of people that they'll feel the need for it, the urge for it, but they don't know where to start. For many people, it will involve work or relationships or perhaps some combination of both. This temptation to play it safe and keep your head down in anticipation of some great reward towards the end of it, which, as we've described, is really a false promise. We are deterred in making change by two things in the main. One is the fear of the unknown. So better the devil you know. At least I don't like my job. Yeah. I don't like my job. My relationship is more or less fizzled out, but at least I know what it is. It's a known quantity. And there's also what other people think. Peers, because I always like to use the analogy of the story of the crabs in the bucket. one crab trying to crawl out of the bucket to get itself free, and other crabs, this has actually been observed, other crabs in the bucket pulling that crab back down in again. Because, oh, where do you think you're going? Because if you get out of this, then that means the rest of us can do it too, and then what will happen?
Yes, and none of us like to be alone in none of us want to feel we're going on a solitary journey. None of us want to feel we're going to be laughed at or humiliated. I mean, I certainly felt that at school, obviously when I was having these deeper feelings, and certainly even then, and certainly more so now, very few people seem to be thinking the same thing as I was. I didn't even dare, bring it to the surface. Ultimately, I do believe it does involve a leap of faith. That's one of the names of one of the chapters on our book. I think the crisis that I've been talking about, I think that it may go away for a certain time, but there is always another thing that we can go through that is around the corner, and if we've opened up anything at all, it will come back towards us. That's a second story I look at there. Fictional stories. One of the fictional stories is a chap called Ed, and he goes on he's going through a bad time in his life. He's had numerous relationships that have been unfulfilling, and the latest one, it seems to be going on the rocks as well. And he decides to go away just on a kind of pilgrimage. It's a holiday, but he ends up on the isle, close to the island of Iona, which, as many people will know, has a spiritual community. I'm an associate member myself of Iona community, and he takes off on this journey almost in spite of himself, and meets someone on that journey, and he trudges along across the island, but he's absolutely defiant that he won't have anything to do with it. It's ultimately, though, he ends up in the abbey on the island, and he realizes that some of the people there, because I met people on the island, have been on courses on the island, they are at least genuine. And if anything, he's discovered because he has been a journalist as well at different times in his career, and he's discovered a lot of cynicism in that job. But something he does appreciate, and he does notice there, is that there are genuine people there who are going through things themselves. And I've been on nights on the Abbey in Iona where people are coming to terms with things, and it's an extraordinary place where people have deeper experiences there, the unique setting of both the island and the Abbey. And he goes through that himself. He's forced to confront truths about why all the relationships in his life have been breaking down, about the very nature of his existence. And he finds there are actually people there that care about him for no particular reason. Has always felt in his life that things have to be earned, and these are what he's finding for the few people there, as these are unearned. That's rather the capitalist system that we live in. We almost feel that everything has to be earned, that we cannot receive things through that word grace. There's a lot in the Christian religion about the grace of Christ, things being given for free if we hand our lives over. And that is what a leap of faith becomes. We have to, in the end, hand our lives over. I'm reminded of when I didn't learn to swim, rather jumping from one thing to another there, but it's an anecdote. So I was 27 years of age. My parents always kind of were quite fearful people, particularly my mother, and kept me away from swimming whenever I felt that, she felt that it was slightly dangerous. Anyway, I finally learned, because I was going to do a bit of traveling, that if I perhaps should learn to swim in case I got into difficulties. And anyway, I went through the whole armband thing, which was slightly embarrassing at 27. But ultimately, it came to the point where the armbands had to be taken off, and I was clinging to the side of the pool. And the instructor, she said, "Well, there's only one thing to do now. You've got to let go. And you will be able to swim, but ultimately, I can't do anything for you at this point. You've got to let go, because you cannot swim with armbands on for the rest of your life. You might find it a bit embarrassing if you keep doing that." So ultimately, I did let go, and the feeling of exhilaration at suddenly finding that I could do it all along. Ultimately, we have to take that leap of faith, and we have to confront the crisis honestly, and then we have to take that leap of faith. But not for 1 minute do I think it's easy. It's particularly in the society we live in, which, as you suggested, you can feel very isolated in doing a situation like, taking that step yourself.
We've touched upon something there which is interesting. I believe seems to be the case that nature and nurture are both tremendous influences on us. In many ways between them, they make us what we are, but we're very influenced by our upbringing. There's no question about that. And you mentioning about your parents being sort of somewhat fearful people reminds me how in your book, for example, that in Peter's story, you describe a man and to a lesser extent a woman, a husband and wife, not having the time to be proper parents. And then if we combine that with all the pressures on children, especially in the societies we live in today, to grow up quickly, everything to do with social media, pressures to succeed at a younger and younger age, sexualization of children at a younger and younger age, becoming so more competitive when what they should be doing is just discovering the world and discovering themselves. And this reminds me of the circularity of it all, how the sins of the father are kind of passed on, and many people struggling today in whatever dimension or capacity in their lives may be carrying something on from those who came before them. And that's another cycle that can be very difficult to break.
Yes, that relates to, although you mentioned Peter's story, there is actually another one of the fictional stories, Robbie, which is in the chapters about the collective mindset. He's a young man who idolizes his father, and his father is he has his own business. He's a self-made man. His ideals are what we come across so much in society, which seems to justify the existence, the capitalist existence we have, or the existence within the system, where his ideals are, you only get what you work for. If anyone gets in the way, you need to batter them out of the way. This is the kind of approach to life. Doesn't matter who gets in your way. You just get ahead of the game, and do anything to head it. And the boy, the way, because his father runs this business himself and he sees him in action, he's an uncompromising character. And the boy's taken in by his father. But he's an element that, and then he ignores the fact that the father is actually a bully in other aspects of his life, particularly in physically abusing his mother. He kind of blocks that out. And equally out in society, he can be in the pub and can end up, ruling the roost and bullying people at work. Anyway, the father, he likes to drink too, and it all comes to the head for him, and he does die early in the boy's life. He's a teenager, and suddenly this boy is confronted with what has happened to his father, someone he had, as I said, he idolized, but he almost, as you just saying, the sins of the father, he almost starts reproducing his father's life as he would see it. He almost wants to do better than his father, because this is all he's ever known. And it's been rammed down his throat, which often happens in society. I mean, all the pressures, as you say, coming through the media about how we're supposed to live. People are facing this all the time, and pressure through social media as well. And the boy almost starts repeating the same life. He mistreats women. He just uses them, and the mother begins to see this, and she tries to point this out to him, and also to point out how she was abused by this man. But he doesn't want to hear it. I mean, there is a solution that I'll leave there. It does come out. The boy does meet someone, a woman who he falls in love with, and it begins to affect him. But he just follows up until that point. A pattern of life almost has been laid out for him by his experiences through his father. And I think a lot of people do go through that because it is all they've ever known, again, until something happens in their life that forces them to confront something else, or the influence of other people, as in this case, the boy's mother and this new person that comes into his life. Other people can influence us. They can change us. We see something that, it puts big questions in our mind about the way we're living our lives.
Well, this attitude, this approach to life that we've been discussing, that sort of go along to get along, putting up with a lot of dissatisfaction and lack of fulfillment in exchange for baubles and trinkets, that in itself, as we've already alluded to, is becoming harder to sustain. We have economic, political, social, environmental crises converging as we speak, and you describe how the 9 to 5 routine has become more like a sort of a 5 to 9 routine now, as work-life balance turns into work-life imbalance. And these sugar highs of sort of consumerism and hedonism are getting ever shorter, and the hangovers are getting more painful. So we're having this conversation now really because so many people who have been going along to get along are being confronted by the need for change. In many cases, it's kind of like whether they like it or not. As you mentioned, you might just be made redundant. Your marriage might just fall apart. It's ever more likely that something somewhat unpredictable or dramatic may take place that forces you to change course or suffer the consequences.
Yes, I think what we're seeing in society at the moment is the system, the establishment are very good at diverting blame for dissatisfaction in people's lives. I mean, obviously, 2008 austerity has had an impact on millions of people's lives across the world, and in so many different ways, not just economically with greater poverty in the world, but whole swathes of people have been affected. I mean, I was brought up being told, I remember meeting an old politician, I remember the name is a conservative, William Whitelaw, years ago when I was very young, and I was extremely dubious about the capitalist system even then, and particularly because he was espousing its virtues, and he kept talking about the trickle-down effect. And I've been waiting for this trickle-down effect for a long time now. And I can't see it's been trickling down to many people in society. In fact, the opposite seems to be happening. And I mean, there's always been poor in society, even in a wealthy country like Britain. But now increasingly, as the wealthiest in society take more and more, I think certainly since 2008, more what we term in this terrible class system, middle class people have been drawn into poverty. And, we talk about working people needing food banks as well now. So I think the system itself, by its very nature, dependent on growth. But the problem is, if people keep taking more and more all the time, there's not going to be enough people in society. If the poor and the middle class haven't got money to spend, then the system itself will eventually implode, because it requires people to earn money, to spend money. And in society, the richest tend to be the ones that perhaps don't spend it the most. They tend to hoard it as well. So the system is in trouble on an economic footing to begin with. It is also and a very unjust system, I find. And I think this impacts on all of us. There's been so many crises in my lifetime or to do with poverty. Today, I think, I read a year or so ago, I don't know, the figures have changed, a person died directly because of poverty, or the causes of poverty, every 15 seconds in the world. It's something like 9 million people a year just dying of poverty. And I think when that comes onto our TV screens, or that has a psychological, at some conscious level, has an effect on us, it says a lot about our media today. One of the difficulties I have with it is, certain things get covered for a very short time, particularly if they're not happening close to home. I mean, the recent environmental crisis in Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Malawi, how long was that? Cyclone Ida, and then there was another one that followed it. It was on our TV screens for a few days, and then there's been a cholera epidemic that's barely been covered. Another cyclone's gone through there, but it's not being covered. If that was happening closer to home, of course. But still, I think people are aware of, because there are so many stories like this, and I think it has an impact on us. So I think there is an awareness within our lives that things are beginning to fragment. We haven't even touched, of course, about the environmental situation, but I think just the system itself, the pressures people have been under since 2008 particularly, I think there is a sense that things are beginning to fragment. But what, of course, the system does very good is divert attention, blame various other people in the world for what is happening. It can be argued that I don't particularly want to bring up the subject of Brexit, but I mean, some people would argue at least that, blaming immigrants, blaming foreigners, blaming what is happening for these people coming over from the Middle East. They're an easy scapegoat, just like they were in the 1930s, but again, this just diverts attention from the main issue, which is the deeper side within ourselves, needing to explore that at times of crisis, rather than diverting attention away from that journey. But I think we are reaching a tipping point whereby we are going to have to, because of the environmental crisis, because of the crisis within the system itself, I think we're going to have to confront these deeper truths sooner rather than later.
Now, I just want to say from my personal perspective that I've hinted at this earlier. I don't believe that individual achievement or material wealth or goods are the enemy per se. We live in two worlds, a material world and there's a non-material world or a spiritual world, whatever you want to call it. There's something other than just day-to-day material dimension of our life, but it's a question of balance. So, but having said that, you're right about contracting growth. We have an economic system predicated on perpetual growth, which is absurd, impossible on a finite planet. We see, we're using GDP figures often as a measure of our well-being, and this is supposed to transfer across to our personal and our inner well-being, which of course it can't. In any event, those figures are under pressure, downward pressure. And you and I are both old enough to remember talk about life in the future, back in the 70s and 80s, and projecting how things were going to be, how utopian things were going to be in 3-day weeks and extended leisure time and all the automation that was going to come in and all the mundane tasks will be done by robots, blah, blah, blah. There have been tremendous advances in technology in our lifetimes, but that techno future hasn't quite panned out. And we're looking at a situation now where in the world in general, so many of the poor in developing countries may, as things stand at the minute, may never achieve the things that they aspire to that you and I somewhat take for granted, like a fridge, clean water, and enough food to eat every day, and a roof over your head. They, may never achieve those things. And that's, a very sobering thought. But also closer to home, we're now seeing, and it's almost a daily news item, how the next generation, younger people, are going to be less well off than the generation that came before them. And again, that was seen as almost like an unthinkable impossibility at one time.
Yes, and it's coming to terms with that. I think the environmental crisis is particularly what is putting that in the forefront of our minds. I think the irony of it, I mean, I agree with what you're saying. Wealth per se is not a bad thing. I mean, it's just because of the figures I read out about globally, the amount of people who are dying, every single day because of the injustices of the system. I think, and then environmentally as well, the pressures. I think we do need to move, and I think there are movements towards a simpler way of life that offers a kind of still a quality to our life, but we do have to face the fact that we do have to cut back. That doesn't mean going back to some extremely austere system at all. It just means shifting away from what I think is becoming a kind of what I would call an entitlement society, to a greater awareness of what we already have in society, in our lives, which perhaps we take for granted. And as part of that, moving towards a sense of personal growth within that, rather than this obsession with economic growth, which I think you just referred to. So, it is going to be a dramatic change for us. I mean, we've there is such disparities in the world. For instance, there are people who fly an aircraft, business-wise, not just holidays. They could be on a plane 5 times a week. And, this is a pleasant debate about new runways at Heathrow, etc. And, the fact is we will need to cut back on that, and our politicians are not doing us any service by, they talk about recognizing the environmental crisis that we face, but at the same breath, they talk about only as long as we can continue to grow. Well, as you've just said, you cannot grow infinitely on a finite planet, So we need, and I think environmentalists are beginning to recognize, even people like George Monbiot, are talking about questioning the capitalist system himself. It's taken him, as he admits in a recent article, a while to get to that point. But he is talking about some of the actions now that we need to take. This question of, eating meat, the vast amount of land it takes to, with regards to cattle, etc., and the cutting down of rainforests. We do need to modify our way of life. We do need to think about the wider world we live in. You referred to other people wanting some of the, the fortunate things that we've enjoyed in our lives. That doesn't mean, as I say, going back to something austere or saying, well, none of us can have washing machines anymore. But, of course, I don't mean that. But it does mean we've to think about, it will mean for our future generation. And as soon as we start with that, in fact, many people are already doing it. Many people are moving into, for instance, there's a great movement with smaller eco houses in the world. Many people moving into smaller houses, and there are many communities around the world where things like that are taking place. So there is an awareness of it to some level, but on the level we require, we do need, and of course this is so difficult with politicians because they're ultimately all about getting elected, and the last thing they want to confront the general population with is a need to reduce the quality of our life by any amount. And they're always talking about, I mean, even tonight on the news, someone talking about, yes, we need to face these environmental responsibilities, but I do believe we'll still be able to increase, never mind just maintain the quality of our life. I find that extremely dishonest. And I think our politicians and behind them, the multinational companies, I think that, they need to be honest with people for the sake of their children and our children.
Well, the way these things are argued quite often by politicians, they like to invoke statistics, don't they? And I think you can only go so far with those. But I think that a lot of their statistical mantras and indeed other things that they like to repeat ad nauseum are increasingly sort of emperor's new clothes. You know, for example, they'll say things like, they'll quote various indexes and numbers at us about how well we're doing economically or in terms of social issues. But the reality on the ground is just, if not completely, then somewhat at odds with that. And increasingly people are going, well, that's just not my lived experience. You can say what you like. For example, one thing that they keep doing, they have done in the last few years, particularly since the big financial crash of 07-08, is talk about the number of people in employment. And in recent months, I've heard politicians talking about that. The number of people in employment, you would expect, given a completely neutral background in Britain anyway, you would expect that to go up because the population's increasing. But I've never heard anyone say, they never really address the quality of work or how many hours people are working, what sort of jobs they've got, but they never say things, well, lots of indices are going to be going up because the number of people in the country is going up. I mean, that's just a simple little point, but I've never heard a single politician address that.
No, and even the opposition, struggle to question them in the right way, and of course journalists to ask the right questions. Yes, I mean, whenever I hear that, I'm staggered that there isn't a response that says, but the number of people on 0-hours contracts, the number of people on a minimum wage, the number of people who, on part-time work. There are families with both parents working, and they're still, they're struggling to make ends meet. I mean, that, as you referred to earlier, I can remember as a child, one wage used to be enough. But at the same time, people are under pressure to have more and more things to keep the system going. We've to buy more and more goods, and at the same time, the quality of those goods isn't necessarily of the standard required. I spoke to a joiner recently, and he was putting in a new kitchen in a house. It was the first time that kitchen had been changed in 20 years. And the first thing he said, well, this one won't last as long because the quality of the product is nowhere near as good. You'll be lucky to get 5 years out of this. It's almost like the system deliberately does that because it is the only way it can maintain itself is by people having to earn more and more money, to spend more and more money, to earn more, and on it goes. That's a form of enslavement to me, It is keeping people locked into a system that ultimately I think is, and perhaps was to start with, rooted in fear. It doesn't have any faith in something beyond this life. So it is rooted in fear, and the fear and the control that the system has on us forces us to exist like this, and it doesn't like people thinking outside the boxes, to asking deeper questions. You see the political control within the media that's tied into it, and it is very hard for people to see with outside of it if they don't come across something in their personal lives that gets them to ask these deeper questions. But I think what is happening globally in an economic sense and environmental sense, and also socially with the great divisions, the injustices in society, I think this is bringing things to a head. I don't think those in power can control it for much longer.
Well, this cycle that you describe, that sort of work, consume, sleep, repeat, that, as I mentioned at the top of the hour, the end, one of the manifestations of that coming to the end, or coming to an end, or at least a seismic change, is what I call the syndrome when Walmart employees can no longer afford to shop at Walmart. Which is ultimately what I look at, because I came up with this idea in my head because I'd seen a news story in the US about Walmart employees and, their working conditions and how appalling they were. And I was talking to a girl who was working at the checkout at Sainsbury's, and she was saying she shopped at Aldi because Sainsbury's was too expensive. And that's exactly what I'm talking about.
Inevitably, the system is going to get more and more desperate. I mean, as I say, the wages are less. The 0-hour contracts, it is trying to give people. It's trying to give people less and less wages. The people at the top are taking more and more, and it's squeezing the life out of people more and more. I mean, I don't know how many of us would have survived in recent times without Aldi's and Lidl's, the difference they've made. But the main thing is that the system is becoming more and more desperate because, as I mentioned a wee while ago, eventually, if people haven't got money to spend and they can't buy things, then the system of growth, then things are being bought in shops, and there's no point in keep producing things that people aren't buying. The system, I mean, I can remember Chancellors of the Exchequer down the years in the UK almost irritated with us, it's a conservative one, saying, for goodness sake, the economy will only continue to grow if you lot will, he didn't say you lot, but if you will only spend more money, and I thought at that point, does he even realize what he's saying? Is as if he's dictating that this is the primary purpose behind our lives, that our purpose in life is to earn money, to spend money, to keep the system going, I mean, is that our purpose on this earth? Is that what we're here for? Is that the only thing we're here for? And I think that question is being asked more and more now, by people, and, particularly the more they see things beginning to fragment. And I think these deeper truths that people are looking at can be reflected in the kind of life that we are going to have to live in the future.
Okay, well, Peter, let's move to a closing segment then and focus on some thoughts about how to break free from all of this and maybe enact change, how that process might begin, what that might look like. For me, and again, we've hinted at this, the key is knowing what you want. So that implies self-awareness, self-knowledge, and real honesty with yourself about yourself and your circumstances, sort of a life audit, if you will. And it's much better to conduct one of these through choice and not through crisis. Though, of course, transformation through trauma is a thing, and many people's lives have changed for the better as a result of something terrible happening to them. But it would be ideal if we didn't get to that point. But whether people are undergoing a catastrophic event in their life and they, something's got to give, things have to change as a result, or whether they just have a niggling feeling that things need to be better and they can't go on as they are, beginning with that self-awareness, I think, that self-knowledge is important. But that, again, it's something we're not really encouraged in. For many people, it's a domain of religion or perhaps spiritual practices, things with a vaguely new age whiff about them. The sort of thing that for many people feel is fringe, and it's certainly got nothing to do with the mainstream culture, of consumerism and entertainment and all the rest of it.
Yeah, I think people are exploring other areas in the time that they have off. As you say, previously it was the churches where people went to, but of course the churches are struggling for reasons that I've spoken about, because they don't offer a genuine alternative to what is happening in society. People can't relate they feel that the churches don't relate to the lives they lead. But a lot of people are moving into mindfulness areas, meditation, Tai Chi, yoga, more creative outlets. They're exploring those. And within those, I think they are just tapping into something that is within themselves. It is opening them up more to things that they've always wanted to explore, even if it's just in an evening class, or a kind of a retreat that they go on once a year, and or it's indeed, a holiday that involves, camping outside nature. I think nature is a great force that resonates within us, with this deeper side. It connects when we're in the hills. I say I live up in the Highlands here, and that kind of walking in the hills, something is happening within ourselves. Or indeed, if we're living in a city, we walk in a park for a particular reason, or all of us are trying to connect. No, we're wanting a break, sure, but we're also, I think there's some aspect of us wanting to connect with something outdoors, and that is really, and I think more and more we want, once that journey starts, we want that to be part of our lives, and because it feels good. I think it is striking a chord within us, and I think once we've had the courage, or we've been propelled into that by whatever has happened in our lives, or we are sick and tired of watching on the television the politicians offering this great deceit to us, then, and I think once more and more people embark on that and talk about that, word of mouth is a great, it does stir things within people. Once you hear about it from friends, or you witness it in friends, then I think there is beginning to be a movement in that direction, and I find great hope in that. And I see up here more and more people taking to the hills in the weekend and exploring these different avenues that are all part of this deeper journey.
We are victims of what I call the 3 pillars of separation, and those are from the world around us. You mentioned nature, from each other, whether as just family or friends or just fellow human beings, who we've never met, but also from ourselves. We're strangers to ourselves. And one of the things, you mentioned meditation, you've mentioned spending time in nature, perhaps spending time alone as a chance to look inside. And one thing, of course, that we also suffer from, and this is exacerbated tremendously in the sort of 24/7 noisy, constantly active societies that we live in, is that we have, generally speaking, we have great discomfort. We experience great discomfort when we're alone, when we're required to be silent or inactive. So, and being alone, silent and inactive, externally inactive anyway, can be very, very powerful ways to tune into something else or to experience something else, to replenish ourselves. But all of those things are, if not frowned upon, then they're certainly not encouraged. You only have to look at people. I call it the dentist waiting room syndrome.
Yeah.
If you've ever watched someone trying to sit and just wait for something, they always have to find something to do, something to say, a noise to make. I usually find actually the quiet coach, the quiet carriage in trains is a good place to be, not necessarily because it's supposedly quiet, but because it's often almost empty, because although people will double up on seats in other parts of the train rather than go into the quiet coach where there's free seats, because being in there, they're required to be quiet and they can't have their devices on all the time. And a lot of people struggle with this.
Yes, I can remember years ago in the Church of Scotland, a friend of mine and I, we trying at the end of the service, instead of, prayer has its place, but the problem with prayer is constantly talking all the time, and it's constantly telling God how we think He should be running our lives, or our higher conscious or higher spiritual being, whatever we want to call this spiritual presence within ourselves. Anyway, we try to introduce silence and meditation. And, there was, as you mentioned, there was a rustling of feet very quickly. People struggle with it. Increasingly we see, you used to see people, I was at Wearily Station in Edinburgh, and people waiting for trains, and the people used to wait quite low, or they read a paper or something, but now almost instantly they arrive on the platform. Of course, the first thing they get out is the mobile phone. It's an accessory to not to avoid. We are uncomfortable, I think, just standing still, and we feel almost embarrassed that people are looking. Maybe we'll become very self-conscious, but we feel it connects us perhaps in a false way with being in touch with what is happening in the world. It is becoming excessive. It used to be a cigarette pouch you would light up on the platform, but it's another addiction, another one of these addictions that the capitalist system has thrown at us to keep us functioning within it. Of course, it has its uses. I'm not knocking it completely, but when you can't put it down, then of course it is an addiction, and that is the state we are in now. The need to explore this deeper presence. It is something. I think there will be a backlash against the kind of social media, mobile phone, technological thing, probably amongst my daughter and son's generation. I think, eventually it is. At the moment, a lot of them can't put it down at all, and we don't know the harmful effects long term it is having on us, because it is relatively short term. But I think they will react against it. You already, certain celebrity people say they are getting rid of it or not using it for certain periods of time, and I think that could influence younger people, because it does prevent people. It is yet another distraction, another addiction that prevents people from confronting this deeper truth about themselves. It has its place if at the same time people are doing that, they are at the same time at the weekends walking in the hills, then okay, But if it is the primary thing that is stopping people confronting this truth, then at this particular time it is a dangerous thing.
You touched upon the notion of meditation there. For some people that'll be kind of, oh, don't know about that, can't do that, don't know anything about it. I'm an advocate of it, as you are, but let's just say this program isn't about meditation. We're not saying that people need to meditate. However, making space within your own mind, within your own being, is just really important in the world that we live in. And for many people, this urge currently takes the form of what I referred to earlier as a sort of mindless leisure and recreation and entertainment. They're looking for a respite from everything that's going on around them. But at the end of the day, it's not really respite. It's just a different colour of the same thing, really. And the nub of it for me is, if the word meditation or mindfulness or any of these things that are they've been buzzwords now for quite a while, we read about them even in the mainstream media, don't be put off by that. From my perspective, what I'm talking about really here is to try to be less reactive to the world around you, less instinctively reactive, flying off the handle, driven to emotional highs and lows and extremes by events around you, people, places and events that are causing you turmoil or are causing what I referred to earlier as sugar highs, surges of temporary pleasure, and then a resulting crash afterwards leaves you feeling terrible. Try to become the observer of these thoughts and emotions and realize that it's not you. Now, we can make a whole show about this in itself, but for me, that's the key. Just trying to still your mind and make some space. And within that space, you then can find a place to think about your priorities or rethink your priorities. Help yourself to know what it is that you really want.
Yes, I think, at some point, there is a manicness to the way we live. If you have a hard week at work and on a Friday night, you go out and spend your money and, have a bit to drink, a lot to drink, and a lot to eat, as if that compensates in a few hours for the very hard work, and for some people, not pleasant work. For others, it's okay, but that isn't really a compensation. And when you wake up the following morning, and particularly on a Monday morning, you've got to go through it all again. Meditation is a central part of the book for me. Every chapter has got a meditation in, and whether it's mindfulness or it's just silence in the hills or walking in the park, because it is transforming, and only experience will lead us to realize that. I've been meditating for over 30 years now. You look at the vast history. People say, well, what evidence is for that? There's a vast history going back ions of people who have sought the quieter side to life, to explore these deeper things. to take them on this journey. So that history is packed with evidence of people have been transformed in whatever way. You don't have to go enough to a monastery to do this. You could just go out walking in your park, but on a regular basis. And the idea that you could, just do it, once a week, or, that there has to be a kind of commitment, rather than as an analogy to what we're facing environmentally. And I said we need to change, and as part of that personal change is introducing in a regular way some kind of silence into our lives. It's a change in a habit, and I think the benefits, as gradually we are being transformed as people, are enormous. Another way to do it is with regards to the environmental crisis we're facing, is just like taking time to consume less in society. Less doesn't have to mean it can actually be beneficial to us. We can actually enjoy, if people who grow vegetables in the garden or something, or you can make something very special out of less. For instance, you can have them instead of, and I must admit we do it, is eat a meal in front of the television or something, but if you have a small amount to eat, but you actually make something of it with candles and sit at the table and, with your partner, and you can make a very special meal out of that, which we've done from time to time, and or you can sit outside, if the weather allows, or even if you've got a fleece on, connecting to nature. As I say, these transforming changes that we can all make in our lives, can have an impact of joining these classes that I mentioned earlier. One particularly suits us. It's realizing that things can change, and a life of excess doesn't necessarily, or even a life of a lot, isn't necessarily the way forward. The system, because the system is built on something, is actually an economic system that is insatiable. It just goes on and on, but it doesn't bring happiness to us. I mean, happiness isn't in the possession of things particularly. It's in a sense, we can discover it in a sense of peace deep within us, in our heart.
The sort of space that I'm talking about creating and that you're offering from your perspective, ultimately, for me, is about confronting a couple of big issues that I think lie at the root of all this. The first one is confronting death, the inevitability of that, and that, of course, then speaks to the nature of life, whether life has any meaning or not. And I think that what a lot of we've been trying to get away from, consciously and unconsciously, for quite a long time, are the fact that life is finite, that we are, as individuals, we are going to die. The issue for many people is that they feel that the life they've been living is ultimately meaningless, so they've been trying to give it meaning externally through all of the things that we've been talking about in the ways that we live. And these are not things that they are things that we do run away from, but they're not things to be afraid of. Ultimately, I find, and you can give me your perspective on this, incredibly empowering to consider questions of the meaning of life and to consider the nature of life and death and our own mortality.
Yeah, I have got a chapter, just returning to the book, on confronting death. And it relates to a woman at the end of she's got cancer and she's running a business at the same time, and she's trying to leave a legacy for her family. And she, as it can be for many people, tragically, it is a very difficult thing to let go, even for people of faith. And a friend in this particular story, Rachel and Ruth's story, is she has some sense of spirituality in her life. But we're all at different stages. We're all on different journeys. But that confronting of mortality does come to us all at some point. As my earlier story about the bishop in the church and the 80-year-old, at some point, even if it's as late as that, we're all, it does refer back to this leap of faith that at some point, each of us will have to take. There is a quote from the American psychiatrist Scott Peck. This is ultimately, I think, what we're aiming at. But, it can take a long time to get there. What he said was, our unconscious is God. God within us. We are born that we might become, as a conscious individual, a new life form of God. If we can identify our mature free will with that of God, then we will have become one form of the grace of God. Now, whether you want to call that God or a higher conscious or whatever, I think in silence, in nature, these areas we've been talking about, meditation if you want, gradually we become we have a sense that we are part of something bigger. I go back right to the beginning of our chat together when I talked about as a child, feeling that there was sensing, maybe because I was close to my birth, there was something deeper within me. There was a sense of needing to go on a journey of truth. I've never forgotten that, and despite the pressures to force me away from that journey of truth has taken me through years of meditation and silence to that sense that we are part of something bigger. I remember feeling about right back then that when my careers officer, we were talking about the careers office, you mentioned, he told me, and the thing that really shocked me about what he said was what I needed to do individually. I was to do this individually or that individually because I had to make my own way in the world, buy this house, buy all the things, everything, the emphasis with individual. And that really surprised me because I instinctively felt that I should have been part of a community, or life was a communal life. I was part of something with other people, and I would make my contribution within a wider family or wider community. I traveled a little bit in the South Pacific because I remember reading about Gauguin and Robert Louis Stevenson from up here who went out to the South Pacific, because they were, and I discovered there that still, even this was in the late 1980s, still an inherent sense of communal living there amongst people. They all lived in small valleys, which were small houses, the different families, and then within that small village there was a communal valley which was easily the biggest building. But they lived this shared sense of life together. Individualism, not individuality, but that was encouraged, but a sense of the individual, as we do in Western society, the individuality is individualistic nature of life is encouraged more than anything. But there was a sense of communal life was more important, and everyone watching out for each other. And I think that, taking me back to the times of science, inherently I feel that is the way we are supposed to live. And I do believe that facing the crisis that we are at the moment, that is what we're going to have to rediscover to get through these crises we face. And I think we will discover something richer in that. I think that will take a lot of the pressure that we feel at the moment off us. I think we will discover something richer in that. Living with less isn't necessarily going to mean, a life that we're going to find austere and lead to a sense of despondency. I think the very opposite. I think we may discover riches in that life that many of us have never experienced before.
Well, closing thought from myself, Peter. We spoke earlier about this idea of sins of the father, how pressures that have come down to us from those who came before us are perpetuated in ourselves and therefore in those who come after us. But I would encourage people, and this is, you make this space within your mind, within your inner self, to look at things, see things more clearly. You can begin to see how that can change in an instant. Talk about tomorrow's another day. Well, each moment even is created anew. You're not what happened to you. You're what you choose to become. And it doesn't matter what happened or to those who came before you, what they did, or what even has happened to you, what is currently happening. That can change in a heartbeat. There are some things that are more difficult to change than others, maybe physical circumstances. We understand that, but it all begins with your thinking. And I would encourage people, don't be deterred. Don't think, I am this, I am that, this happened to me. My father was such and such, so therefore that's what I am. I will never be able to do X, Y, and Z. Because all that's doing is you're talking about what you cannot be, or what you are without choice, what you cannot do, what will never happen. And if those are just thoughts, then what have you got to lose in flipping them around? Absolutely nothing.
Yes, no, I agree with that 100%. I mean, it's, I think one of the, for many people, one of the tragedies of the economic system in which we live is how it restricts us, how it confines us into particular roles. You see this then acted out on our television programs, where the only questions that seem to be asked of people are, what's your name, where'd you come from, and what job do you do, as if that sums us all up. We have vast potential, and I believe all of us have some kind of potential that, at times at school we tapped into it to a degree, and then and in our education, but then get lost in the need to function within this society. I think given more time, and I think we may in time move to a more balanced sense of work, and because we always need to work, but a more balanced sense of work and time to reflect and be more creative. Then I think we can discover the more whole side to who we are, and we can move away from this restrictive way of living, this collective mindset way of living that, almost preordains the way we should live our lives, when that is anything but the truth.
Today, Peter, we've been talking about your book, Spiritual Beings or Economic Tools, Just Who Are We? Now that's widely available. People can find it easily, all the usual outlets. Before we sign off, just tell folks about your website or anything else you'd like to share.
Yes, I have my own website, and that is www.peterstrother.co.uk. It's a WordPress website where I write about the various things. I try to keep up blogs and information about new books that I hope to have coming out soon. I'm continuing to explore new forms of writing, both fictional and non-fictional, and will try and keep my blog up more regularly than I do. But no, I'm, like all of us, watching what is happening in our world today very closely, and wider than our own media coverage, coming from a journalist background. I'm encouraged by the different forms of media that are available to us now, that are offering different views. Things are shifting out there. They are changing. And while many of us are very anxious about the times ahead, at the same time, I think we are moving into times where there are new opportunities and changes taking place.
Splendid. Well, once again, Peter, thank you so much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Thank you. It's been good to talk to you, Greg.